What if the modern world wasn't shaped by politicians or generals, but by a quiet coup waged in boardrooms and private banks? In 1914, as the world braced for war, a financial system on the brink of collapse found its unlikely savior, not in victory, but in crisis. Behind the smoke of battlefields, the true conquest was being engineered. Debts were transformed into weapons, central banks seized control, and governments became clients of the financiers who once served them. This wasn't a side effect of war. It was the plan. And its architecture still controls the world you live in. In August 1914, while European capitals echoed with patriotic speeches and military anthems, a far quieter set of orders were issued in the private offices of the world's largest financial institutions. As millions of young men boarded trains bound for the front lines, central bankers and elite financiers were engaged in an entirely different kind of mobilization. One not measured in battalions, but in balance sheets. The war, which the public believed had erupted from assassination and nationalist fervor, offered a rare and perfect cover for a financial system that had already collapsed in silence. In London, the world's premier financial hub, markets froze before a single shot had been fired. The Bank of England had held emergency meetings with leading bankers throughout 1913, frantically trying to paper over liquidity holes too deep for gold to fill. Germany's central bank, the Reichsbank, was even worse off, issuing unsecured notes against overextended commercial paper just to delay insolvency. Paris, Vienna, and Rome all faced similar conditions. The architecture of global finance, built over decades of reckless expansion and imperial debt-fueled speculation, was buckling under its own weight. When war came, it provided a masterstroke of narrative redirection. Gold redemption was suspended. The London Stock Exchange was shuttered for 5 months. Across Europe, governments declared moratoriums on debt payments and asset write-downs, reframing insolvency as patriotism. Banks that should have gone under were granted emergency lifelines by their respective states, backed not by solvency, but by the new religion of national emergency. For the first time in modern history, the rules of sound money, long enforced by the gold standard, were discarded not as scandal, but as necessity. What had been considered fiscal heresy became the doctrine of survival. Underneath the patriotic fervor, a different war was being won, one in which private financial institutions converted their worst liabilities into public obligations, backstopped by the blood and taxes of nations suddenly at war. And crucially, this was not a temporary arrangement. The moment governments became dependent on banks to fund their mobilization, the power dynamic inverted. No longer did banks answer to states. They became their essential partners, creditors, and ultimately, masters. The transformation was swift, global, and largely invisible. A banker in New York now held more influence over Britain's war effort than many of its own generals. A German financier could profit from both the victory and defeat of his own nation. The old world of sovereign monetary policy, national banking, and democratic accountability was overthrown, not by a revolution or occupation, but by a silent transfer of authority masked by the noise of artillery. While the world believed it was fighting to defend civilization, a new regime was quietly being born, one ruled not by parliaments or emperors, but by the balance sheets and contracts of those who had turned crisis into conquest. Long before the first rifle cracked in Sarajevo, the true crisis gripping Europe wasn't political, it was financial. By 1913, the continent's great empires were economic illusions held together by credit, illusion, and imperial bravado. Banks in London, Paris, and Berlin had expanded their deposit bases by over 400% since 1870, yet their gold reserves, the backbone of credibility under the gold standard, had grown by less than a quarter of that. This imbalance wasn't just risky, it was mathematically suicidal. In London, interbank lending had become a silent battlefield of mistrust. Overnight rates spiked unpredictably, signaling that even among themselves, the banks no longer believed in each other's solvency. Continental Europe fared no better. In Paris, real estate speculation had inflated prices to fantastical levels, and French banks were overloaded with colonial bonds and loans from South America and Russia, many of which were already in technical default. In Berlin, the Reichsbank was quietly accepting junk collateral from its largest clients just to keep liquidity flowing. The great imperial banks had overextended themselves on visions of endless growth, financing railways across Africa, naval bases in Asia, and steel foundries far beyond demand. But the problem wasn't merely speculative, it was systemic. Every bank's survival depended on every other bank remaining solvent. Should one fail, the collapse would cascade instantly through a network of interconnected obligations. And as gold, the only asset that could restore trust, was hoarded in national vaults, the very lubricant of this financial machine began to disappear. Central bankers met in secret, desperate to engineer stopgap solutions. The Rothschild network, with branches in multiple European capitals, began orchestrating quiet gold shipments and interbank guarantees. J.P. Morgan's partners in New York sent private telegrams warning that unless a new global credit architecture was created, the collapse would be total. The founding of the U.S. Federal Reserve in December 1913, pushed through during the holiday recess, was not a reform. It was a rescue operation prepared in advance. Across Europe, insiders were liquidating risky assets before the press could catch on. Insurance firms began refusing to underwrite certain bank bonds. Newspapers downplayed bank exposure, as many of them were owned or subsidized by the very institutions they should have been investigating. The public was told everything was fine, right until it wasn't. But the war arrived just in time. A conflict of nations gave cover for the collapse of their financial empires. With governments now desperate for war funding, the same insolvent banks that should have perished in a credit implosion were transformed into state partners, wielding power with impunity. What the world mistook for a sudden descent into chaos was, in reality, the perfect alibi for a banking system already on life support. The war didn't cause the financial collapse. It postponed it, concealed it, and most importantly, redeemed those responsible by rebranding their failure as national sacrifice. When war finally broke out, the transformation was instantaneous and astonishing in its scope, as if decades of unspoken financial desperation had been waiting for a single spark to justify their release. Within days, governments across Europe suspended gold convertibility, the very foundation of their monetary credibility, without hesitation or apology. Overnight, the chains that had bound central banks to discipline were shattered, replaced by the limitless freedom of printing paper promises unbacked by anything but patriotic necessity. Stock exchanges, which would have collapsed under the weight of margin calls and vanishing liquidity, were shut down under the pretext of preventing panic. But the truth was simpler. Closing the markets prevented the public from seeing the insolvency that insiders had long recognized. Banks that had teetered on the brink of failure in July suddenly found their survival guaranteed by governments now dependent on them for war finance. Treasury ministers assured the public that deposits were safe, not because banks had improved their positions, but because the state had quietly agreed to assume their losses. The most audacious maneuver, however, unfolded in the accounting ledgers buried deep within financial ministries. Decades of risky private loans, failed railway ventures, collapsed colonial projects, overextended industrial credits were discreetly exchanged for government-issued war bonds. What had been toxic liabilities threatening to detonate on bank balance sheets became patriotic assets backed by the full faith and future taxation of the nation. In a single stroke, the burden of reckless speculation was transferred from shareholders to citizens. What had been bankruptcy became heroism. What had been failure became duty. The war created a new financial alchemy, transforming the worthless into the indispensable.
banks emerged from the supposed catastrophe stronger than ever, armed with guaranteed returns on government debt and liberated from the constraints that had nearly destroyed them months earlier. And governments, now lashed to their
Creditors, for the survival of their armies, discovered they had ceded more authority than any parliament had ever intended to surrender. The emergency measures sold as temporary fixes quietly became permanent architecture. By the time the public understood that the rules of finance had been rewritten, the coup was complete. War had not destroyed the financial system. It had saved it, and in saving it, had handed it more power than it had ever possessed in peacetime. As the war escalated and national treasuries strained under the weight of mobilization, the balance of power between governments and banks tilted irreversibly. Once mere intermediaries, banks now became indispensable lifelines, not just supplying credit, but defining the very terms of state survival. With gold redemption suspended and money creation unbound, central banks extended themselves into previously unthinkable territory, backstopping government borrowing at scale, absorbing massive issuances of war debt, and setting the stage for a new economic order where sovereignty would be measured not by flags or armies, but by the credibility of bond markets. In London, the Bank of England underwrote billions in war loans with implicit guarantees that future generations of British taxpayers would foot the bill. German banks eagerly bought war bonds, backed by promises of post-victory reparations and colonial plunder, knowing full well that repayment wasn't the point. Control was. The great financial houses of France, having previously sunk fortunes into Russian loans and failing imperial outposts, now laundered those debts into tranches of war financing, swapping risk for patriotic virtue. Through this mechanism, private banking losses were transmuted into national obligations, payable not in dividends, but in austerity, taxation, and inflation. Shareholders who once faced annihilation were spared, while citizens who had never consented to these risks found themselves yoked to debts they neither chose nor benefited from. Governments, desperate for continued access to funding, had little room to negotiate. The banks had become too critical to offend. In exchange for liquidity, ministers surrendered autonomy. Monetary policy aligned with creditor expectations, and wartime accounting fiction turned into post-war fiscal reality. Clean balance sheets at the top came at the price of hollowed-out public ledgers below. These were not ordinary loans, they were permanent transformations. The debt issued in 1915 would shape budgets in 1955. What had once been cyclical finance became structural subordination. No longer were banks instruments of national policy. Nations had become vehicles for institutional preservation, tasked with honoring the debts that had saved the financial system from collapse. Even in the United States, which entered the war late, the story followed the same script. The Federal Reserve facilitated enormous government bond sales, pumping money into the system while cloaking the operation in patriotic language. Liberty bonds, war-saving stamps, and do your part slogans disguised what was essentially the absorption of private banking risk into the public domain. This was not debt incurred for infrastructure or development. It was emergency credit converted into sovereign servitude. The war didn't just redraw borders. It redrew the boundary between public and private, where the risks of capitalism were quietly nationalized and the profits of crisis flowed upward. Long after the armistice, the obligations remained, embedded in tax codes, central bank mandates, and national debt ceilings. The banker coup was not a one-time heist. It was a permanent shift in who held the reins of economic power and who would bear its cost. In December 1913, as the European financial system creaked under decades of over-leveraged empire building, the United States quietly passed the Federal Reserve Act during a holiday recess, a moment almost invisible to the public, yet seismic in consequence. Sold to the nation as a safeguard against future banking panics like that of 1907, the new central bank was marketed as a tool for economic stability and sound currency management. But its true function, as events would soon reveal, was far more expansive and far more strategic. By the time war engulfed Europe in August 1914, the Federal Reserve was not only operational, it was uniquely positioned to perform the very functions that European central banks could no longer sustain: issuing elastic currency, discounting commercial paper, and coordinating emergency liquidity across a fragmented system. Officially, America was neutral. Unofficially, the Fed was preparing to become the world's new lender of last resort. The timing was uncanny, almost as if designed for the chaos ahead. While gold reserves in Europe vanished behind shuttered vaults and stock exchanges, the United States stood untouched and solvent, armed with a central bank that could issue credit not backed by metal, but by confidence and geopolitical leverage. As the war raged on and Britain's coffers thinned, J.P. Morgan Jr. was appointed as the official financial agent for the British government in America. But it was the Federal Reserve that made his operations viable at scale. Through coordinated discounting and clearing operations, the Fed enabled Morgan's syndicate of 2,200 banks to channel billions in credit across the Atlantic. The Fed didn't just facilitate war finance, it orchestrated it. By 1917, when the U.S. formally entered the war, the central bank rapidly expanded the monetary base to accommodate Liberty bond issuance, purchased by both institutions and the public. The gold standard was not abandoned outright, but it was neutered, reshaped into a vestigial symbol rather than a true constraint. The Treasury and the Fed became symbiotic instruments of monetary expansion. The war gave them license. The Fed gave them machinery. As a result, American industrial production soared, not just feeding its own troops but arming the Allies, fueling ships, railroads, and weapons factories from coast to coast. For every ton of steel and every shipment of wheat, dollars flowed back into American banks, often leveraged against foreign debt obligations that would linger for generations. When the war ended, Britain, France, and their allies owed the United States more than $10 billion, a staggering sum that flipped America's global position. In 1914, the U.S. had been a net debtor, reliant on European capital. By 1919, it was the world's largest creditor, with the central bank now functioning as the heart of global liquidity. The Federal Reserve, born in peacetime as a domestic reform, emerged from war as the central engine of a new financial empire, one where America no longer borrowed the terms of world trade, but wrote them. By 1915, with Europe engulfed in trench warfare and financial exhaustion, the true nerve center of the Allied war effort was no longer in London or Paris. It was on Wall Street. J.P. Morgan Jr., heir to the most powerful banking dynasty in America, had secured a role that went far beyond financier. Appointed as the official purchasing agent for the British and later the French governments, Morgan wielded an authority unmatched by any general or politician outside the battlefield. Every artillery shell, every locomotive shipment, every barrel of oil purchased with Allied funds was routed through the ledgers of Morgan's syndicate. His firm coordinated with over 2,000 American banks, manufacturers, and shipping companies, transforming a private financial house into a centralized command for wartime logistics. While American newspapers preserved the illusion of neutrality, Morgan was already underwriting the survival of Britain and France with complex credit instruments, quietly transforming future Allied tax revenues into present-day steel, food, and ammunition. Under his direction, a transatlantic supply machine emerged, one that produced wealth for American corporations at an unprecedented pace, while binding the Allies to Wall Street through a web of interdependent obligations. Morgan's firm earned commissions not just on loans, but on every transaction it facilitated, every contract it approved, and every ton of goods it helped deliver. As such, profit was built directly into the function of war itself. This wasn't philanthropy, it was leverage. By the time America officially joined the war in 1917, the groundwork had already been laid. Morgan had floated over $1.5 billion in Allied loans, nearly $35 billion in today's dollars, while holding the keys to military procurement for half the world's armies. Morgan offices in New York operated like a de facto Allied Ministry of War, overseeing weapons purchases, coordinating with railroads and port authorities, and settling debts across continents. In practice, Wall Street became the creditor, quartermaster, and economic architect of the Allied campaign. Morgan's power extended so deeply into the European war machine that when governments in London or Paris debated strategy, they often did so with the knowledge that future funding would require Morgan's continued cooperation. This centralization of purchasing gave Morgan immense indirect control over what weapons were built, what food was prioritized, and what infrastructure would be preserved or neglected. American neutrality was a fiction in every sense except the official one. By the time Congress declared war, the financial machinery was already in motion. American entry was not a leap into the unknown, but the formalization of a role Wall Street had been playing for years. And when the armistice eventually came, the debts remained, ensuring that the nations Morgan had funded would spend generations paying interest on the weapons he helped them buy. The war was not just won with bullets and blood. It was administered through ledgers, dictated by contracts, and managed from skyscrapers that never saw a battlefield. In this new era, capital didn't just influence war, it operationalized it. As the war dragged on past its second year, a profound shift occurred in the way governments, banks, and even citizens understood the nature of the conflict. It was no longer just a battle for territory or national honor, but a desperate financial equation where victory alone could justify the mountains of debt that now underpinned entire economies. War bonds weren't just patriotic investments, they were victory-backed securities whose value hinged entirely on one side winning. Every new offensive was financed not with existing capital, but with borrowed money whose repayment depended on post-war reparations, access to conquered resources, or economic domination of rivals. In Britain, the Treasury issued bond after bond to fund the war machine, selling them to the public with slogans like, "If you cannot fight, you can help your country by investing." But the fine print told a darker story. Repayment assumed not just survival, but triumph. France and Germany were even more aggressive, creating massive tranches of public debt while projecting that enemy defeat would fund reparations to make the numbers work. In Berlin, the Reichstag's financial forecasts openly relied on hypothetical indemnities from Britain and France. In Paris, victory over Germany was expected to unlock a windfall of Ruhr industrial assets and coal supplies. Even the United States, entering late, embraced the same logic with Liberty bonds, which promised not only interest, but the implied stability of global financial leadership, if the Allies won. This created a system where the war could no longer end through diplomacy. Peace without victory was not financially viable. It meant default, broken currencies, and political collapse. The logic of finance had overtaken the logic of geopolitics. Each day the war continued. Debt accumulated further, and the need for total victory became existential. The longer the conflict, the higher the stakes, and the deeper the dependence on winning. Bankers and policymakers alike understood this dynamic. Central banks worked feverishly behind the scenes to suppress signs of monetary stress, sterilizing inflation, concealing insolvency, and preventing the public from realizing just how fragile their nation's financial positions had become. The press, often financed or influenced by the very banks underwriting the war, reinforced the idea that perseverance meant prosperity. But the margins were razor thin. In Germany, currency debasement quietly accelerated. In Britain, gold exports bled reserves to dangerous lows, hidden only by emergency wartime secrecy. In France, tax increases lagged far behind expenditures. On all sides, the machinery of war now ran on deferred promises, and any outcome short of decisive military success would render those promises worthless. The result was an irreversible escalation. Limited objectives vanished. Negotiated settlements became impossible. Total war was not a choice. It was a financial necessity. Victory was the only collateral acceptable to the institutions underwriting the greatest debt experiment in human history. And so the war raged on, not just because of national pride or political ambition, but because peace had become the costliest option of all. When the guns fell silent in 1918, the world expected peace. But what followed was not reconciliation, it was accounting. The Treaty of Versailles, far from being a framework for healing, functioned as the final movement in a symphony of financial entrapment that had begun years earlier in bankers' offices. Behind the grand language of peace and justice, the treaty enshrined a system of transnational obligations that locked entire nations into debt servitude for generations. Germany, blamed solely for the war, was ordered to pay reparations totaling 132 billion gold marks, an impossible figure designed not for repayment, but for perpetual leverage. Yet Germany didn't have the capital to pay, not after 4 years of economic devastation. So it borrowed, primarily from American banks, which saw an opportunity to recycle wartime profits into post-war control. German bonds were sold on Wall Street, and the proceeds were wired to the Allies. Britain and France then used these funds to repay their own war loans to the United States. The result was a circular debt chain in which dollars left America, passed through European treasuries, and returned to their origin with interest. This wasn't economic recovery, it was global debt laundering. At every step, the financial system skimmed returns, entrenching Wall Street's role as the indispensable engine of European solvency. This was no accident. The structure of reparations and repayments ensured that Europe remained permanently dependent on American capital, and thus on American terms.
Germany's domestic policy was now under international surveillance. Britain and France, though nominal victors, were beholden to the banks whose support they had relied on for survival. And the United States, while outwardly advocating peace and democracy, had used its late entry into the war to emerge as the world's financial overlord. Versailles gave this arrangement the force of law, cementing debts into treaties, binding generations to the repayment schedules crafted by bankers who never saw a battlefield. The true power lay not in the League of Nations, but in the creditor-debtor contracts that flowed through New York clearinghouses. The Dawes Plan of 1924 and the Young Plan of 1929 would later restructure these obligations, but always in ways that preserved the system's logic. Debts must be honored, regardless of political instability, economic depression, or democratic will. The so-called peace had created not a new world order, but a financial circuit of entrapment, where nations' fates were dictated by repayment schedules and interest compounding at geopolitical scale. Germany's currency collapsed in hyperinflation, France's rural provinces stagnated under taxation, and Britain's industrial base eroded under the weight of servicing its dollar liabilities. Yet the system held, because it wasn't designed for prosperity, but for control. Versailles wasn't a conclusion. It was a conversion. Of war debts into sovereign chains, of blood into interest, of national sovereignty into collateral. Peace had been signed with ink, but enforced with ledgers. Out of the wreckage of war and the tangled web of Versailles repayments emerged something entirely new, a financial architecture not designed to prevent crisis, but to manage it in perpetuity, on terms dictated by the very institutions that had once needed saving. The 1920s and 30s saw the formalization of a banker-run world, one where sovereign governments ceded critical aspects of monetary control to unelected financial institutions operating above the reach of parliaments or voters. The Bank for International Settlements, BIS, founded in 1930, was sold as a neutral clearinghouse for German reparations, but functioned as a supranational hub where central bankers could coordinate policy in secret, free from the noise of democratic debate. Its meetings in Basel brought together the heads of national banks in closed-door conferences that set interest rates, liquidity flows, and currency realignments long before any elected official was informed. Meanwhile, the U.S. Federal Reserve, initially created to manage domestic panics, began taking on international responsibilities, becoming a de facto global lender of last resort. During financial crises, it funneled liquidity not only into American banks, but also into European ones, stabilizing foreign markets through dollar-denominated swaps, while subtly positioning the dollar as the new standard for global transactions. This evolution was not a neutral process. It was ideological. The logic of private banking, centered around risk insulation, debt servicing, and asset protection, became the default operating system of global finance. national economic policy was increasingly judged not by employment levels or living standards, but by how it served bondholder interests and maintained investor confidence. Fiscal decisions, whether to fund hospitals or raise pensions, were made in the shadow of debt ratings and credit default swap spreads. Countries that defied this logic, such as Weimar Germany or later Argentina, were punished with capital flight, currency collapse, or exclusion from lending markets entirely. The guardians of this system presented themselves as technocrats, calm, apolitical stewards of economic stability. But behind the bland language of macroeconomic prudence and inflation targeting lay the same power dynamics forged in the fires of World War I. Private institutions dictating the terms of national survival. The transformation was subtle but irreversible. What had begun as temporary emergency measures, suspensions of gold redemption, state guarantees for insolvent banks, centralized war procurement, became permanent features of a financial order built not to serve the public, but to preserve the solvency and supremacy of those who controlled the flow of money. Even central bank independence, lauded as a safeguard against political interference, was in practice a formal declaration that monetary policy would be dictated not by the needs of citizens, but by the preferences of global creditors. By mid-century, the institutions born of crisis had become the quiet masters of the global economy. Behind every sovereign flag stood a spreadsheet, behind every election promise, a debt ceiling, and behind every financial decision, a banker whose name the public would never know, but whose influence would shape the destiny of nations. The world we live in today is not the product of democratic evolution or the natural arc of free markets. It is the outcome of a financial coup that began not with a declaration of war, but with a declaration of insolvency. The crisis of 1914 threatened to unravel the global banking system, but instead, it became the proving ground for a new kind of power, one that would not rely on armies, but on flows of capital, layers of debt, and the myth of economic neutrality. Governments, once sovereign over their money and accountable to their people, became clients of the very institutions that claimed to rescue them. What began as emergency interventions, suspending gold convertibility, centralizing war finance, creating supranational institutions, quietly hardened into permanent infrastructure. And once these systems were built, they began to replicate, embedding their logic in every layer of global governance. By the time the 2008 crisis hit, the same mechanisms that were pioneered to save banks during
World War I were activated again. Private losses socialized, toxic assets shifted to public balance sheets, and central banks expanded their mandates far beyond anything imagined a century earlier. The tools had changed, but the blueprint had not. Governments now rotate through fiscal policy like managers, but the rules remain fixed. Interest rates, inflation targets, capital adequacy ratios, and debt-to-GDP thresholds form the modern scripture of governance, not voted upon, but enforced through markets. Political will bows before bond yields. The consequences of defiance are not military invasions, but currency devaluation, credit downgrades, and capital flight, silent weapons wielded by invisible hands. The banker coup succeeded not because it was planned in the shadows, but because it embedded itself into the very definition of order. Stability became synonymous with financial obedience. Growth became contingent on credit. Security became a function of central bank liquidity, not national strength. And in this new order, crises are not signs of failure. They are opportunities for deeper consolidation. Every downturn triggers new interventions, new mandates, and new dependencies. The institutions that failed the public are rescued by the public and emerge with even more control than before. It is a system that learns how to fall upward, that punishes risk only when it threatens the architecture, and that thrives on the illusion that there is no alternative. The architecture of our modern world, retirement systems tied to equity markets, national budgets constrained by interest payments, currencies floating in a sea of speculative flows, did not evolve naturally. It was forged in panic, ratified in treaties, and maintained by a class of technocrats whose power is neither acknowledged nor contested. The banker coup was bloodless, but not harmless. It reshaped the boundaries of the possible and redefined the meaning of sovereignty. And because it arrived wrapped in the language of salvation, few recognized it for what it was, a regime change executed not by soldiers, but by spreadsheets. The modern state is not post-war, it is post-coup.